Throughout life, we meet others who have insights and experiences quite unlike our own. The great ideas of classical works resonate differently with them. Often these treasures of mind and heart go unshared, reserved from others in the course of daily life. But what if we took the time to have those conversations, to sit down and recall those thoughts, those impressions upon us that moved us along our path? Why then, we would no longer be alone, and at least for one shimmering moment, someone else could see the world through our eyes. I give you the Confederal Reserve. Welcome to the Confederal Reserve presented by BetterPears. I am your host, Dr. Jason Fugikawa. The Confederal Reserve is a show that connects old friends, that is, Confederates, to discuss the ideas and classical works that have shaped their lives and worldviews. Before we get going, I invite you to like this episode, subscribe to the BetterPears channel if you have not already, and click the bell icon to receive notifications so that you remain the first to know of future interviews and podcast episodes. If you would like to support the work of BetterPears with your Federal Reserve notes and receive fractional gold in the mail each month, please follow the link in the description to our crowdfunding program, BetterPears Leaves. As a special bonus for the rest of 2024, every qualifying contribution earns an entry into our monthly Market Mug giveaway. Official rules are available at betterpears.com/leaves. Now then, the structure of our show is our gimmick we want you to mimic. Our guest for the episode will offer a classical work of particular import to his or her life. What ensues is a conversation that uncovers insights and offers new perspectives on old works. It is a conversation between friends, which is the building block of the cultural renaissance that BetterPears seeks to foster. Our guest today is Mark Forrester. Mark has taught theology, literature, and mathematics at classical high schools for the past 10 years. His talent for combining seemingly distinct fields of study will be on display in his forthcoming mathematics novel, Above Not Up, with Bandersnatch Books. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest today on the Confederal Reserve, Mark Forrester. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, good to be here. Good to see you, Jason.
Glad to have you on the show. We kick things off right away with our first question. What is your vintage work and why is it so important?
Yeah. So the work I chose is Euclid's Elements. Euclid is an ancient Greek mathematician, the father of geometry. And in his Elements, it's a series of 13 books with over 400 propositions, basically building up the geometry from just some really basic first principles, which leads to some of the things that I really, really love about this work, namely that it gives true knowledge. It's not speculation. It's not opinion. It's a true universal thing that you can come to all on your own. Just by kind of following in his footsteps, you can come to know true things. That's not terribly common. There's no room for debate. The truth is certain, which leads to kind of the second thing that I really like of getting a lot from a little. Euclid begins with 5 postulates and 5 common notions, basically just self-evident principles. And he says, grant me these truths. And then with a compass and a ruler, I will build the entire geometry. There are no prerequisites. No prior knowledge is needed. All you need is a compass and a ruler, and you can build the mathematics from the ground up. Mathematics kind of gets this rap that it is opaque, inaccessible body of knowledge. And that's really unfortunate because mathematics could not be further from that. True mathematics is, it's really creative art form. You begin with simple, beautiful ideas and see where they go. And that's what's great about Euclid. He begins with these simple propositions or these simple principles, and then he builds up everything. And as the student, you just need to follow. You can go on your own side quests and have your own beautiful ideas and learn from his methodology and come to new truths that he doesn't necessarily cover. But if you want to just kind of stick to his path, it's accessible and it's readable. It's still difficult to follow. It actually demands our attention, but you can just kind of follow in his footsteps and build the geometry from the ground up. And to contrast this, my experience of geometry, the first experience I had geometry was as a sophomore in high school, when on day 3, we were told to open up to page 27, look at this little shaded rectangle on the page. This is called the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Do exercises 1 through 25 for homework. And that's it. There's no story, no drama, no historical context. No work is done by the student to know why this is even true. And for that very reason, students often complain that math is boring, and they're not wrong. When you strip mathematics of its context, of its story, of its drama, it is boring, because then it just becomes drills. And mathematics is not drills. It's not training. It is a creative art form. And so the way Euclid goes about it, you do not get to the Pythagorean theorem on day 3. Actually, you get it at the end of book 1. You have to go through 46 propositions before you are worthy of seeing the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. And again, it's not just a formula that's in a box. It is this elegant picture that you build up from a right triangle. You are unable to see why that must be true until you go through those other building blocks. And there's something really exciting about kind of reaching that climax of the book, that this is not something that was given to me. This is something that I earned. Every truth, every proposition is a hard-earned truth that leads to this final destination. And no one can take that from you. It is yours as the student. And I've always just really loved that, especially compared to what most modern mathematics education consists of being given a formula and apply it to a bunch of fabricated, problems. But there's no creativity. There's no real work. There's no thinking through logical truths to come to new truths. One of the other great things about geometry, especially with Euclid's Elements, is that geometry is one of the 7, liberal arts, part of the quadrivium. And because it's a liberal art, like we were saying before, you don't have to have any prerequisites. You can start at any time. Most people take geometry when they're in 9th or 10th grade in high school, but really you could be in 10th grade or 10 years old. It is so fundamental that you can really start anytime. It is accessible to everyone. And that kind of leads to the last thing that I really admire in that, similar to theology, like if I were to pick another work, I might pick the first 11 questions of the Summa Theologica by St. Thomas Aquinas, precisely because it covers what we would call natural theology, where we try to know what can we know about God without any divine revelation, just using our God-given faculty of reason. What can we know is true? And Aquinas kind of walks us through, first, that God exists, but also that he is good. He must be perfect. He must be immutable, and along with the rest of them. And you kind of get a lot from a little, just our reason. We can come to know so many true things. And it's just a really lovely process. But that act of thinking carefully, of paying attention, it's a difficult task. It's not for the weak-minded. It's not for the impatient. It demands our attention. And especially today when, everything has to be, the length of a reel or just a few seconds of a soundbite. Mathematics demands that you sit with the problem and think carefully about it. You might be working on a problem for an hour and not make any progress in terms of like actually getting to a solution. But Simone Weil has this great article on thinking about education with respect to our Lord. She says that like even if you spent a whole bunch of time thinking about a mathematical problem, especially a geometry problem, you might not get any closer. Or you might think that you're not getting closer, but you're actually making progress on a whole nother plane that will only be revealed in prayer. And that's what I think is so special about this aspect, that because it demands our attention, it's like prayer in that respect, that it builds this habit of mind that disposes us to prayer, to be able to sit and pay attention. There are It's easy to kind of want to sit down and pray, and just as soon as you're not doing something, your mind's distracted. The mathematics kind of builds this habit of being able to sit and think carefully and pay attention, and really trying to focus on what's important. Um, yeah,
No,
Vey talks about that.
I resonate
Sorry.
with that. That you've given me a lot of avenues to go, which is good. We've got a tree with lots of tangents. Uh, but on that last point about sort of insight and being sort of right disposed to wait to have that insight. In my own experience, not so much with Euclid and geometry, but with classical languages, with Latin and Greek, right? That there's sort of like the diligent work of learning all the forms and the morphology and how words change, but there's something to just sort of struggling with a sentence, not like a sentence in a textbook, but what I like to call like a sentence in the wild, right? An actual
Mhm.
like bona fide ancient text, and and then allowing kind of my mind to sort of adapt to the Latin of Virgil, where he makes up rules that are just sort of his rules, but you can't complain because he kind of is the language. Uh, and then you had this sort of flash of insight, right? This sort of like it wasn't there, and all of a sudden it is clear uh, that that you realize, you have to kind of put in your attention, your work, your focus, and yet at the end of the day, you can't force the insights to come, right? It's kind of like fishing, right? In that sense, right? You can be quiet, you can put the hook in the lure or whatever where it's supposed to be at the right time of day, right? But you can't make the fish bite it. And there's something sort of active and passive both about, I think, geometry and the study of mathematics as a whole, and the study of language, really, right, the liberal arts and that human experience. One thing that I want to kind of hear more from you on is, uh, you talk about sort of the accessibility of Euclid in the sense of like, I suppose 10, you have to have some probably knowledge of like the physical world around you. Like infants, they have a hard time talking, paying attention. So there's some sort of like early age where you can understand, you know these truths, and equal, quantity and those kinds of things. But then that extends into old age. Yet at the same time, uh, it is Euclid's Elements something that you need a guide for. Like we hear all these sort of like Renaissance prodigies, and like, oh, Pascal like deduced Euclid, by age 8 or whatever. Like they make a random age where they deduced all the proofs or whatever of Euclid. Is how important is the guide in taking you through Euclid, or is this something where like the book washes ashore on the deserted island and you're able to kind of just grasp everything?
I would say that it is more of the latter, where you could pick it up having no prior experience, and uh, you could get through it. Excuse me. But you might get hung up on the very first page, because and I say that
It's,
because
it's
the very
hilarious.
first.
You could do this. You could just pick this up and do this yourself, or the first page will throw you for a zinger, and you just
But well,
you don't know.
I say that because having a community is really helpful. And the reason I say that is because, like all of the ancients, we might call Archimedes and Pythagoras mathematicians, but really, like, they would not have thought of themselves that way. They would have seen themselves primarily as philosophers, and so like that demands more than just kind of what we would kind of think of a mathematician. So the very first definition, because before he gets to the postulates and common notions, he gives a series of definitions. But the very first definition is: a point is that which has no part. Whenever I teach geometry, I've never spent like less than like 4 class periods talking about just that one sentence. What in the world does he mean by a point, because we all think we know what a point is. I have students, go up and they draw a dot on the board and they say that's a point. That can't be a point, not according to this definition. Like, a point is that which has no part. So just that very first definition requires a lot of reflection, and so you can ultimately get to it. And I think once you start to see kind of what he's talking about, and as you work your way through, second definition, a line is breadth as length, etc. You start to kind of build that kind of that way of thinking that Euclid has. You could read through the definitions and then start going through the propositions, and maybe you'll realize, oh, my original understanding of the definitions was wrong, and so you might have to kind of keep coming back to those. So it's not impossible. It would just be kind of slower going. I mean, similar to go back to the natural theology section of the Summa. He says, like, we could use divine revelation and make a lot of progress really fast, or we could just use our reason and we could make progress, but it'd be very slow and full of errors. And geometry is kind of the same way. Like, we have Euclid as a guide. You could build the geometry yourself, but unless you begin with that careful reflection of, like, when I say point, I have to mean a zero-dimensional thing that doesn't take up any space. That's pure location, but that's not intuitive. It's not your in your immediate experience.
When we think experience of that, right?
Exactly. Like an even line. When we draw a line on a chalkboard or a whiteboard, technically that's not a line. It represents a line, but according to Euclid, a line is breadthless length. A line is to the corporeal eye invisible. It is primarily a figment in our imagination, and we try to actualize it and try to visualize it with a streak on the board. But that's a really hard thing to finally get into our way of thinking, that when we're talking about these things, we have to be very precise about what we mean. And kind of to go back to your point about classical language, there's a great book by Christopher Derrick called Escape from Skepticism, about kind of the liberal arts and classical education. And one of my favorite lines from that is, he talks about how two of the best things that you can do in high school is study Latin or some kind of inflected language, or ancient language, and Euclid's Elements, because the language will help you focus on, like, careful attention to the meaning of a word, and geometry or Euclid will help you focus on the careful logical steps of going from one proposition to another. That training yourself to think that carefully about the meaning of words, about the flow of logic, is really difficult. So you could pick up a copy of the Elements washed up on shore, and it wouldn't be a waste of time, even if you misunderstand a few things here and there. But it is pretty straightforward, right? You read through Proposition 1. It may not make sense the first time, but kind of like a poem, the first time you read it, it kind of is jarring. But then you read it the second time, you're like, oh, I see what he's doing. I see why he's putting this line here. I can see how his thought is progressing, how he's setting things up to manifest some truth. And the more you kind of steep yourself in that way of thinking, the more wisdom you really start to see in mathematics in general, but especially in Euclid's thought.
So maybe the next question is more of like a pedagogical question then, because as soon as you mentioned sort of this idea of needing to be reflective at the beginning, but that perhaps naturally those errors get kind of threshed out as you move. What is the importance of say the guide or your teacher or your instructor in allowing that gap to occur, right? Because sometimes perhaps, and maybe you're kind of you have the best experience of this in the mathematical realm, right? Of allowing a student to persist in error, because to alleviate them of that error immediately would not allow them to develop the habit of understanding when the logic that they're using does not make sense, right? Is invalid, and then to coming to the grips of, okay, what is the true reality of a line? Uh, you know, where have I gone wrong? Do you find that in your own kind of instruction of teenagers, essentially, uh, that that they need to be able to kind of in that safe space of a geometry class, uh, uh, kind of walk in their errors a little bit, and then to realize that they haven't quite seen it, and then maybe come back to you, or invest themselves back into the text in order to realize where they went wrong, right? In church history, we have ecumenical councils to handle that problem, right? And they're glorious affairs of sometimes soap opera quality, but in a math class, it's like small potatoes, right? Not so much
Mhm.
like, hey, we're in formal or material heresy. No, like we don't understand what a square is, right? Uh, and but do you see like the educational value of that, not just in the terms of like what they know, but in sort of the habit of realizing when someone's in error and being able to rectify that situation, right? Because that's, I think, how we get lifelong learners, people
Mhm.
who are willing to realize that the things that they were thinking are distinct from themselves and their value as human beings, uh, or their worth as human beings, right? We're not going to talk about value of human beings, uh, and uh, and to be able to say, okay, no, I was wrong there, right? Is that, do you see mathematics as sort of this, not just a playground, but this sort of like battlefield of working with false notions, false ideas that then need to be corrected?
Yes, and I would I would say it's more of a playground than a battlefield, um, and that's where my work as a teacher comes in primarily. Excuse me, and it's also where we end up having the most fun. Usually, before we actually read or present one of Euclid's propositions, I'll take whatever truth he proves in that proposition and kind of give it to them as a challenge. The very first proposition is how to construct an equilateral triangle, uh, and it's always a lot of fun because everyone thinks that they can draw an equilateral triangle, or everyone, students might walk in saying that like, oh yeah, I know that the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. All right, cool. Uh, but they have no idea why that must be true. And what's great about about geometry, and especially when you throw it out as a challenge, like, uh, can you build a square? Can you build an equilateral triangle and know with certainty that it has to be an equilateral triangle? I mean, oftentimes they'll just try to eyeball it or whatever, and it's like, that's nice. It looks great, but I don't have any reason to believe that that is true. And so then they kind of that kind of starts to sink in, like, oh, maybe I don't know everything that I thought I know, or know how to get to that truth, how to make that truth manifest. And with other propositions, it's so much fun. And this is where the creative art aspect of mathematics really comes out. And it'll have some really brilliant ideas, and then I get to come around and they say like, "Hey, does this work?" And then we kind of go through it together. And I was like, "This is awesome. It does lean on knowledge that we don't yet have, right? It requires some truth that we actually haven't acquired yet. So maybe this isn't wrong, but it's leaning on some, like, can we prove this with less?" And now they have a new challenge. They know that they have had good ideas, and they build off of that. Or sometimes they just have completely erroneous ideas, and that's where I get to come in and be like, it's a cool thought, but I don't think this is actually true. And here's some kind of counter examples as to why that's not true. I don't think we can lean on that step. Try something else. And if sometimes students have no idea how to begin, and that's often the case because most people have not had an opportunity to engage mathematics as a creative art form yet. They haven't actually had to sit with a problem. Um, and so I get to come over and just be like, well, what if you just draw this line here? What might we see now? Can we start to like kind of piece some things together? Lean on what we've discovered already, and usually that's all that's required. It's just one good kind of starting idea, and then they build up the propositions together. Like I've had times where 5 different students will create legitimate proofs for the same truth, but they're all different. I often compare it to kind of like in an art class. If you put a bowl of fruit in the middle of the room, everyone's painting the same thing. Nobody paints it the same way. Own original piece of mathematics, this own work of creative art, unless you're able to dabble in error, dabble in bad technique, you won't draw that perfect thing on your first go. You won't hit the bullseye on your first shot. Um, and that's really my primary role, is to present beautiful problems, and then as they're working through it, just offer suggestions, offer some insights, give them a good idea here and there, but never too much. Don't show them how to do it, but try to lead them kind of in the footsteps of Euclid without them knowing it, so that they kind of come to that truth themselves. And then we read Euclid together after they've already struggled with that problem. They're like, oh, this was a way better approach. Like my proof had 18 steps. Euclid did it in 3. And like that's a really remarkable thing. And that's art criticism. That's being able to like read each other's poetry and be like, this is a great poem, but here are some things that I think would make it better. And Euclid is just, the the father of geometry. So like he has the best proof already worked out. And so after you try yours and you read his, it's like, that was a better way to do it. And you can learn from his technique, right? That's why, you'll never find a poet or an author who doesn't read. If they do, they probably won't be very good. But we learn from masters. We learn from people who are better than ourselves. But we also have to give it a go and really suck at the art first, and be allowed to kind of wade through through those erroneous times in order to make a good piece of art. And to your first question of how important is that time at the very start, I think it's paramount. As the ancients say, a good beginning is half of the whole. If you get those first principles down and you can understand very well, or as well as you're able to, those starting principles, everything else kind of flows. You keep on having recourse back to those first principles, uh, and then you're able to see the truth more clearly. But if you read the definitions, the postulates, and the common notions, and they just seem kind of jargony, and you're like, whatever, I just want to get to the first proposition, it's gonna be more difficult. Like you have to spend some time, make sure you have a solid foundation in those principles, because then you're less likely to fall into error. You're less likely to misconstrue certain things. So yeah, really important to have that beginning time, and absolutely paramount for the student to be able to sit with wrong ideas for a little bit and then be shown the truth. There's something really magical about that process.
Yeah, I imagine that the I would say the exploration of what Euclid has to offer in his elements is a I'm just like uh, oftentimes, probably for ill and not necessarily for good, people view and children through the people who are their parents view education in its sort of practical terms, in terms of like, okay, this is some sort of career or vocational assistance and training for you to go do things in the real world. And I imagine, right, that the structural engineer has problems with the theoretical side of Euclid, in the sense of these breathless widths and whatnot, where the cable for my suspension bridge definitely has a width, and that's important for the structural integrity of said suspension bridge. And so there's like a tension, I think, that uh, our contemporary world has with something like Euclid, insofar as there does seem to be some truth that is on display or kind of gathered from this study, and yet um, truth that can be applied practically, and yet kind of the disposition one must have in this study is to not be grounded in what is sort of visual or practical in that sense, but to allow kind of the mind to think in the abstract, right? So maybe it's less from like theoretical and practical to like sort of abstract and concrete or material. And so how do you navigate that um, kind of distinction where there are uses to this that are helpful, and yet I think perhaps I don't want to speak for you, but that your desire for the student is to kind of right develop that inner disposition, that habit of mind of thinking logically, of thinking clearly about the proofs based on the premises, based on the logical flow of the statements being made.
Yeah, yeah. It's what I actually just wrote an article on this. There's this meme that I come across at least once a year that says something along the lines of, "I'm so glad we learned about parallelograms in school. It's really come in handy this parallelogram season." Uh, and obviously the joke is that like parallelograms have actually no use in our world. Like, yeah, even for the structural engineer, there's probably uh, no actual use of knowing about properties of parallelograms, or very little. Uh, and it's a solid joke. Don't get me wrong. It's a solid joke, but it really misses the point of education. Um, and I think mathematics is unfairly targeted with this kind of bias, because mathematics is the easiest to quantify, largely because it has to do with quantities. Um, but we don't apply that to any other discipline. No one says, like if somebody says we study mathematics so that you can get by in the real world and be a good cashier or whatever. Uh, Nobody says anything like that about reading Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. Why do we read the Scarlet Letter? Oh, so you can learn empathy or something. Like nobody says that. We read good literature because it's good literature. And mathematics really is the same. That like we do mathematics because it's good and it's true and it's beautiful, and it's good for its own sake. Um, it does have some practical application, and that is a really beautiful thing, right? It is really convenient that having some number sense can make you really good at like quick calculations when you're calculating a tip or whatever. But we don't study mathematics so that you can be a tip calculator. We don't learn how to read so that you can fill out forms at the DMV. And imagine if we treated literature classes in that way. If they used DMV forms to learn how to read, nobody would learn how to read. And for good reason, because that would just be miserable. But we treat mathematics in that way of like, here's a bunch of, uh, problems of multiplication or long division or whatever. Do these. This is what mathematics is. And to read, to learn how to read by reading a great work of literature. Likewise, it's better to learn mathematics by, following the footsteps of a great mathematician. But if you take any of those skills, reading is a very practical skill. I can now read off of a menu that doesn't have pictures, but that's not why I learned how to read. Likewise, having some number sense or spatial reasoning is really good, but that's not why I sat down for that discipline. It's so that I can have access to these beautiful ideas. I want to be able to read Brothers Karamazov, and that's why I want to learn how to read, not so I can do something that might be useful. The use is always secondary. It's always a byproduct, and it's great. But as soon as we make that usefulness our primary aim, we tend to strip any kind of beauty or any kind of fun out of that project. There are places where we do want training in a certain skill, right? I want my airline pilot to be very trained on his job. I don't want him to necessarily know about like all of the theory or whatever. I want him to be able to fly the plane. And so training is a really good thing in certain contexts. But when we're talking about, great pursuits like poetry, literature, history, language, mathematics, any use that we might get from those is always, always, always going to be secondary. The primary purpose for any of those disciplines, any of those pursuits, is just to encounter these beautiful ideas in the wild, as you say, uh, not for any use that we might get from them.
I remember having discussions over Saint John Henry Newman. It's weird to call him Saint John Henry Newman now. He's been John Henry Cardinal Newman for so long. But Saint John Henry Newman, in his idea of the university, uh, has this line about knowledge for its own sake, and everybody scoffs at that. All the kind of the practical people in the world uh, scoff at that, particularly if they're in some sort of like, even in the university, some sort of professional field, right? So like nursing or uh, medicine, law, engineering, those kinds of things. So like knowledge for its own sake. No, it's got to be useful. And I think they miss what Newman is trying to say there, right? That knowledge for its own sake is not just that we have very pristine, well organized libraries, right? As if this knowledge is sort of like instantiated in these books or on hard drives or solid state drives, right? Because we're catchy, but that the knowledge is actually existing in the form of human beings, right? It is this habit of knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that has been cultivated in these beings that will be everlasting, right? That is the great work of the university, and I think that that's to your point, right? It isn't so much that these truths exist, but that you're able to bring them into the lives, into the intellects of your students, right? Because the student is much greater than the bridge. The student is going to last longer than the calculation of the tip at the restaurant. Now they just put to the iPad in front of you, right? So so I think one way to square this idea would be to think about in education the idea of what is the greatest thing in education, right? The highest level of being. Well, insofar as there might be, God and in his omnipresence, whatever angels might be there, but then human beings would be the greatest thing in the classroom,
Hmm.
in the order of being, and then the perfection of that human being, right, would be the purpose of the classroom. And so there's a certain perfection of the intellect that occurs in the study of mathematics. Like we call it mathematics and Monthano, right? In the Greek, there's the verb to learn. Like it's not, you know, we think of mathematics as simply as numbers, but I think more fundamentally it is this operation of coming to know what was unknown, right, from what is known, right? That we take the clear things, the the first principles, common notions, and then we come to know what is unclear, the various proofs and theorems that are kind of progress in Euclid, from these clear things. You take the clear things to learn the unclear things, and those unclear things then become clear, and then you progress, right? That is the movement or the derivative of mathematical knowledge, right? That movement of change, that rate of change of increasing knowledge, uh, and and that happens in people, right? And maybe you're listening to this interview and you're wondering, like, what is he talking about, right? uh, C.S. Lewis, in his image in the Abolition of Man, is like it, the modern British schoolboy, that's his context, right? Isn't some sort of jungle in needing of being kind of bushwhacked back, but deserts in need of irrigation, right? Another image that I've used in education is like every student comes in with this sort of like fire of wonder, and the goal of the instructor is not to put out that fire, right, but to kind of set it ablaze. And Euclid is one of these texts, one of these kind of gifts from the ages that fans the flame, right? That if you can get a student to catch that spark, and you have a remarkable talent of getting students to catch that spark, right? It will take off in new directions, right? It will be something that they carry with them through through their adult life. And I think so often in education, the goal of the drills, the mathematical drills, I couldn't tell if you were making a joke earlier about boring, where it's either boring like snore snore or boring drill drill, and it can kind of be both,
They
right?
have the same etymology,
Uh,
yeah.
mathematics could, yeah, mathematics could be boring in both senses of boring. uh, and how that kind of extirpates, right, or pulls out from the roots, right, the 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 desire to kind of grow in wisdom and awe and wonder. It puts out that fire, right, of insight, of what could be, and only settles for what is. And so I don't know, I find this topic fascinating, and want to, and I know your project, your novel coming out is like that. So I want to give you a chance to kind of tell us a little bit about your project coming up, and how our viewers can follow your work.
Yeah. So at the beginning of 2025, should be released. It's a book called Above Not Up. The basic creature were to visit someone here in our world, uh, and like kind of what would they be capable of, and all the fun hijinks that they can get into. If you're familiar with Flatland, this is kind of Flatland but one dimension up. A person in our world, and this four-dimensional being. Her name is Tess, and she's capable, because she's a higher dimensional being. She's capable of all kinds of things, like appearing wherever she wants. Going from one place to another in seemingly no time. Um, and it's just a really fun introduction to what a fourth spatial dimension would be like. We don't necessarily get to it in geometry, but one of my favorite tutorials whenever I teach higher mathematics is the fourth dimension, and kind of keeping on this theme of we can know true things from very little. If there were a fourth spatial dimension, there are we can know truths about that dimension. And so Tess, being this four-dimensional creature, come crashing into our world, she's capable of all kinds of things that would confound us. But really, they all make mathematical sense when you realize that she's just operating from a higher dimension. Just like, if I were to interact with a flatland creature, all my actions would be perplexing, but they make perfect sense if you have an idea of what the third dimension is. So it's a fun introduction to the fourth dimension, uh, and yeah, I'm really excited for it. It's been kind of a passion project of mine, and yeah, it should be coming out at the beginning of next year with Bandersnatch Books. You can go visit their page at bandersnatchbooks.com. They're doing a lot of really great things over there, and so yeah, I encourage you to check it out if that sounds like something you'd be
Yeah.
interested in.
And we'll have the link in the description to this video below. Two things. As a classicist, I'm glad that you have a fourth dimensional character named Tess, and the kind of the tetra root, and well played. I always like it when the characters' names relate. Uh, second of all, the intended audience for a book like this. So this be for school age children. Would this be like kind of like Bluey, and like adults can enjoy it too, but then pretend like they're reading it with their kids?
Uh, Probably school age, or even young adult. But if you're an adult and you've never thought about the fourth dimension, I would hope that you would be able to enjoy it. Uh, the the things that are presented in it, the ways that the kind of imagination bending things that happen, should be just as marvelous for an adult. But in terms of style, it is geared towards a more high school or young adult audience. Um, but hopefully, an adult would be able to enjoy it as well.
From your description, it sounds somewhat reminiscent of something like the space trilogy of C.S. Lewis, right? Where he, while he's dealing in more of a spatial movement between the planets and how all that kind of works, but the interactions with beings of a higher, right, level of
Mhm.
existence seems to be fruit for a lot of good theoretical, right, speculative, right, and not in the sense of like not real, but actual, um, the reality of, again, that hierarchy of being. So encourage our viewers to check that out. Again, the description is below. I'd like to thank you again, Mark. It's a pleasure having you on the show today. And to our audience, from all of us at the Confederal Reserve and the BetterPears Cultural Empire, thank you for watching. See you next time on the Confederal Reserve. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. You can click here to watch a recent interview of the Confederal Reserve, or over here to view the playlist of the BetterPears podcast.